So if you were a game company and you wanted to release games for the NES, you had to go through Nintendo of America first, and they had some very strict policies. Nintendo had a lot of control over the production of games, and many companies were negatively impacted by this. But one company that suffered the most was Konami. They were forced to modify their games in order to be in compliance with Nintendo's demands, and even created a second brand name in order to bypass Nintendo's rules. How did this negatively impact Konami, you ask? Well, let's take a look. What's going on, guys? It's Pojer, coming at you with the 13th video of the year. So we're gonna jump right into Nintendo and Konami, but first, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button right there. Secondly, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button for me. Anyway, we're just getting right into it today. It was 1983 and the Famicom was released in Japan. There were 3 launch titles for it: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Back then, it was really impressive to see how close these games looked to their arcade counterparts, but when you compare it to games that were released a few years later, these look very primitive. Why such a big jump in quality after a few years, even though it's on the same console? Well, for one, these launch titles were made in 1983. Not much of a standard had been set yet. This was the standard. But the other reason is because these 3 games didn't use any mappers. For those who don't know, a mapper is a chip that goes inside the cartridge unit that boosts the capabilities of the Famicom, or NES. Game companies were thinking of ways to get the most out of the NES. By using special chips in the cartridge, you're getting better hardware performance than what the NES is normally capable of. In 1985, Super Mario Bros. Was released. From a programmer's standpoint, this was a very complicated game, and it was the best you were going to get without using a mapper. With that in mind, when Konami released Contra in Japan, it used a mapper called the VRC2. This expanded the amount of memory the game had. As we can see, the Japanese version of Contra had cutscenes, a stage map, and animated trees in the background. This VRC2 chip enhanced the game in ways we never thought was possible. However, this was only in Japan. Nintendo of America didn't allow companies to use their own mappers, so when Konami released Contra in the US, they had to settle for the UN-ROM mapper, which was the best chip at the time that was approved by Nintendo of America. This particular chip was not nearly as capable as the VRC2. As a result, we get an NES game that is much more bare bones in comparison. The trees in the background are now completely stationary, and the stage map and cutscenes were removed. So Konami had to downgrade their game in order to comply with Nintendo of America, but still, at least the gameplay stayed completely intact. Contra wasn't the only game that Konami had to modify before a US release. The Japanese version of Castlevania 3 used the VRC6 mapper, which increased the amount of sound channels on the NES from 5 to 8. But when it was released in the US, Konami had to replace it with the MMC5 mapper, which doesn't support the extra sound channels. As a result, the music sounds more like what you would normally hear on the NES. To be fair though, this one isn't completely Nintendo of America's fault. The VRC6 mapper wasn't capable with the North American NES, so this wouldn't have worked even if Nintendo of America allowed this chip. So both of these are examples of Konami being forced to downgrade their games before releasing them in the US, but at least the core gameplay stayed intact. However, we're going to talk about a Konami franchise that wasn't so lucky. The first NES game Konami released in the US was Gradius, which was a very well translated port of the arcade version. It's a really creative shooter where you start off very slow and weak, but as you collect power-up items, you can boost your speed and firepower. Unfortunately, some small downgrades had to be made from the arcade version. In the arcade version, you can collect what the game calls options, which are copycats that give you extra firepower. In the arcade game, you could have a total of 4 options, but due to hardware limitations, the NES version only allows you to have a total of 2 options. The arcade game also features stages that scroll vertically. Unfortunately, the NES version had to remove the vertical scrolling, so we only get horizontal scrolling here. Vertical scrolling would have been very difficult to perform on the NES because of the status bar on the bottom. In early NES games that have a stationary status bar, horizontal scrolling was never a problem, but when moving vertically, it cannot be done in a fluent motion. When you take a game like Legend of Zelda, for example, which is a game that uses a stationary status bar up at the top, vertical scrolling looks fine, but when the screen moves horizontally, it looks very choppy. Konami most likely didn't want Gradius to feature choppy scrolling. Even though this game was scaled down from the arcade version, thankfully the US version was not scaled down from the Japanese one this time. This was an early title, so Konami wasn't experimenting with mappers that much, at least not yet. So the game was able to be released in the US without making any cuts. However, this would not be the case with the spin-off title Salamander. This time, Konami tried to address some of the issues that Gradius had. Now you can have up to 3 options rather than 2, and the game actually features vertical scrolling, both of which were possible because of the VRC3 mapper. This game also has a really nice and flashy title screen, but as you may be able to guess, Nintendo of America didn't allow Konami to use the VRC3 mapper, so some cuts had to be made. Released under the name Life Force in the US, we can see that the flashy title screen is gone, and now you're back down to a maximum of 2 options rather than 3. Thankfully though, the vertical scrolling is still intact. This one is extremely unfortunate because this is the first time where the gameplay was directly impacted because of Nintendo of America's policies. Now that you can only obtain a maximum of 2 options rather than the intended 3, the US version of this game is a bit more difficult. Still an excellent game, but up until now, we haven't seen the actual gameplay get affected by Nintendo of America's policies. As we can see, Konami was trying as hard as they could to release their games in the US with everything intact, but Nintendo of America was really making it difficult for them. If that wasn't enough, Nintendo of America even controlled the amount of games that publishers were allowed to release. Konami had a huge library of games they wanted to bring over to the US. So to get around this restriction, they created a second branding called Outtro games. This way, they were able to release 10 games a year instead of the normal 5 that Nintendo allowed. Games like Ninja Turtles, Metal Gear, Roller Games, and others were released under the Outtro games branding. I'm just really trying to showcase here how difficult it was for Konami to satisfy Nintendo of America's demands. They had to sidestep them numerous times, and it would cost them the extra innovations that some of the Japanese versions of these games had. But if we're talking about games that were impacted greatly, there's one that comes to mind. So there was Gradius, which was scaled down from the arcade version. Then there was Life Force, where some of the features that were cut from the previous game were kept in the Japanese version, but then some of those perks had to be cut from the US version anyway. But Konami wasn't done. They would really push the limits of the NES with their new Famicom title, Gradius 2. Konami really wanted to preserve the arcade experience as much as possible, so they used the very powerful VRC4 chip for this game. It actually scrolls vertically and horizontally at the same time. At this point, there were a few mappers out there already that were capable of vertical scrolling despite a stationary status bar. This was an extraordinary accomplishment as game developers could make their games bigger while still allowing players to view the information they need. Sometimes you would see some residue at the end of the screen, but that was just a small side effect. In the case of Gradius 3, the ability to now scroll vertically and horizontally meant the levels could be bigger, and you had some more intense boss fights that could use background graphics rather than sprites. By not using sprites, the bosses can now be bigger than ever and can move in multiple directions. In earlier games, developers had to use sprites as bosses, which meant they had to be smaller in size. Another big upgrade, you can actually have up to 4 options here. It was impressive that Salamander had 3, but Konami was really trying to match the arcade experience, and they finally got it right with Gradius 2. This title also happens to be a very big game. You can customize what power-ups you want your ship to have. Some stages feature multiple bosses, not just one, and some of the effects they pulled off here are really nice. This is my absolute favorite Gradius game for the NES. The VRC4 chip allowed Konami to make the game the way they wanted it, and what we got was an excellent title. Except, we didn't get it. Unfortunately, this game was never released outside of Japan. So what happened? Well, as we know, when Salamander was released as Life Force in the US, Konami had to downgrade a couple aspects of the game. Could this have been done with Gradius 2 as well? It's possible. Konami might have been able to use the approved MMC3 chip. This chip allowed for vertical scrolling with a status bar, and it was used in games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Kirby's Adventure. But Gradius 2 was very dependent on the VRC4, and it's possible that it would have been too much work to make this game compatible with a different chip. I do suspect that Konami was originally intending on releasing Gradius 2 in the US. Most Famicom exclusive games tend to have a lot of Japanese culture in them, whether it's references, humor, or even just the language. But Gradius 2 doesn't have any of that, and the game is completely in English. This could have easily been released in the US had Nintendo of America allowed third-party mappers to be used, but unfortunately, we never got this game. When the Famicom was first released, the games were primitive in nature, but companies wanted to push the hardware limits as much as possible, so mappers started being produced. But Nintendo of America was very strict when it came to third-party mappers. When Konami released Contra, their own mapper really polished up the game with graphical enhancements, but when it was released in the US, they all had to be cut. Their other game, Salamander, suffered the same fate. And finally, one of their greatest achievements was Gradius 2, but unfortunately, we never got to see this one on the North American NES. Nintendo of America really held back Konami, and they were forced to downgrade their games to accommodate Nintendo's demands, but in the end, they still delivered excellent games. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.